This video was made possible by Battleaxe. Hey, it's Jake, and in this video I'm going to teach you how to make some really interesting looking limbs using Rubberhose 2 and teach you how to dial in the look exactly the way that you want it so that you're not always getting that classic bendy rubber hose look. And I'm going to be giving away the project file so you can use the styles that I teach you how to make. Let's get right into it. All right, first things first, if you're not familiar with Rubberhose, it's a character rigging system that allows you to rig in 3 different techniques. The first and probably most popular way is using the Rubberhose system. And that's what I'm gonna show you how to use in this video and how we can take it a little bit further than just that bendy hose. But there's also a rubber rig system and a rubber pin system. And those are things that I'm probably gonna cover in future videos, but they allow you to work with artwork that isn't necessarily shape layer based, which opens up a lot more possibilities with the types of artwork and characters that you're able to use with this rigging system. But like I said, for this video, I'm gonna stick to the Rubberhose system. And I started by looking for inspiration. I think one of the first things that a lot of people have trouble with when getting a character rigging system is not really having much experience with character design. And so their characters generally will look very simple and not all that interesting. So what I like to do is go find inspiration from character illustrators, from people who actually know what they're doing when it comes to character design. So I went over to Dribbble to search for inspiration, and I found this artist named Daria Semenova, and they have an incredible portfolio of character designs, and I just fell in love with them. So as I was scrolling through this, what I was paying attention to the most was the way that the limbs were illustrated, because that's what I'm going to try and recreate. And I found this character in a really interesting yoga pose, and I just loved the way that the cuffs of the pant legs and the sleeves here are hanging off, how they're not all the way down to the wrist. It's just a very pleasing looking design. You know, the limbs aren't perfectly uniform all the way down, the sleeves taper. So there's a lot of interesting things here that I wanted to see if I could recreate using Rubberhose 2. So let's jump into After Effects and see what I came up with. This is the final design, the 2 limbs that I modeled after that character design. Now I did add this extra line right here on the leg, but overall this is a pretty much one-to-one copy of Daria's artwork. So Daria, if you're watching, thank you for being an amazing illustrator, and I hope you don't mind that I'm drawing so much inspiration from your character designs. But what I want to do now is show you how I built these limbs, as well as a couple of other styles, so that you can see how you can approach making your own custom looking limbs using Rubberhose 2. And I'm giving away the project file that contains all of the styles that I'll be showing you in this video. You can find that link in the description. So why don't we just start with the arm over here. Now I have Rubberhose 2 docked in my After Effects workspace right here. This is what it looks like. I'm gonna start by creating a just standard hose, no styling at all. I'm just gonna click new Rubberhose, and actually I'm gonna give it a name. So let's say new arm. Shoulder, wrist is what I want those controllers to be named. So I'll click new Rubberhose, and it's going to generate this hose for me. So this is what I'm talking about with that classic bendy hose limb look that a lot of old cartoons used. That's what this whole system is modeled after, but Rubberhose 2 can do so much more than just this. In fact, if I just jump over to the style category, there are lots of presets that you can apply to your hose as soon as you create it. So if I go to, say, this knob knee and I apply that style, we're gonna get this cartoony knobby knee style that's totally customizable. We can dive in, change any of the settings that we want on the styling, and you can even save your own styles as presets. But let's go back to just the standard hose. I'll undo back to where we were, and we're gonna build everything off of this. So first of all, I like to get my limb in a straight line. So I want to set this hose length to not be so long. Maybe I'll have it be more like 540 pixels. And then the way that I like to get this perfectly straight is to parent the wrist to the shoulder, or the tip of the limb to the root of the limb. Then just go to the position, because now these values are relative to the parent, and I can zero out the X position and type in the hose length for the Y, and that will put it exactly at 100% length, and it's perfectly vertical now. Then I'll just unparent that, and this will be the framework that I use to rebuild this arm over here. So why don't we start with the sleeve over here? I'm gonna break this up into the sleeve, the cuff, and the arm, and we'll just start with the sleeve since it's the largest. So what I wanna do is go into the styling for this limb. So new arm, this is the layer that's actually the shape layer that we're seeing for the limb. So I'm gonna open that up, go into the contents, and we have a style folder. This is where all of the styling for this limb is taking place. And you know what? I already can tell I don't have enough screen real estate while recording. So what I'm gonna do is close all of my other comps, and then I'll just click and drag my comp timeline and then move it over to the left edge. That way we're gonna have more space for our actual comp viewer, and I'll be able to see the whole thing all at once. So feel free to rearrange your workspace however it's best suited to you. Character rigging and animation takes up a lot of screen real estate, so a lot of times my timeline will be docked to the left side of After Effects. But now let's go back into the style of this layer and look at what we have in here. There's another group called Base Hose. So this is the base standard default hose styling. All it is a single stroke on top of this arc. And it's all reactive to wherever you move the controllers. So I want to change this stroke, number one, to be the same color as the sleeve. So let's go into that stroke, change the color to match this sleeve. And then I want the stroke width to also be bigger. So I'm going to increase that until it's, I don't know, let's say 70. Now it is hard to see, but there are controllers here. I'm just gonna grab the wrist and change the color to something that's more visible. So maybe, I don't know, this yellowish and green color. Click OK, and now we can see them nice and clearly. And now I'll always be able to know where the start and end of my limb is. The next thing I need to do with this is trim it so that it's actually a sleeve and not just the entire length of my hose. So let me go into the Add menu and I'll add a Trim Paths. And this is going to trim that path before it's styled, before the stroke is applied. So if I go into Trim Paths and I back off the end, that's actually where the shoulder is. Instead, I need to grab the start and move it back. I'm not gonna be too worried about making this exactly the same as what I have over here, but roughly the same. So let's just say 30%. And now we're only getting a portion of that hose. Next, let's take a look at the fact that there's actually a taper on this version. So we can actually take advantage of the stroke taper that's now built into After Effects. There actually is a tapered limb that you can use in the styling, Tapered Hose 2020, but we can make a completely custom style right here just by using the taper. So let's go to the end length and just increase that, probably all the way up to 100%. That's gonna taper from the end to the start, and then I could go to the end width and increase its width. So we're setting a minimum width here, basically. It's a percentage of whatever we have up here. Now, the taper is very subtle, but it's enough to notice that it's not just a standard uniform width stroke. So I'm gonna drop that down to maybe 80. That even might be a little too extreme. We could say 90. And there's just a very subtle taper there, maybe 85. We'll go in between there so that it's enough we can see it, but not so much that it's really exaggerated. Now the issue we have to deal with is the round cap at the wrist. So on the final version, I've got this shape that is the cuff, and I actually made a separate style just for that cuff that overlays on top of the sleeve, but you can clearly see that we're still not getting that rounded cap at the end. So there are actually a couple different ways that you could go about doing this. One is doing it right here inside of the taper. So if I turn my start taper up by any amount, so let's just say 1, it's gonna shave off that round cap, but it's doing it in a way that's giving us this kind of angled ending, and that's not what I want. I basically want it to be straight. So if I go into the start ease and increase that, then we're gonna get something that looks a lot more straight. And this is probably gonna work just fine. What's interesting about this is that because our start length is so small, we're just barely getting round corners on the end. So if I hold Control or Command while clicking and dragging, that will change the start length slower, and you could kind of round this off and basically create the same effect over here, but imagine that instead of seeing into the sleeve, the part of the sleeve that's in front is covering up. So the perspective is kind of shift. That could work if that's what you were going for. Now, I wanna show you another way of doing this same thing, just so you can see some different approaches. So let me undo back to before we added any start length. And what I wanna do is rename this group. It's still named Base Hose, but I'm just gonna rename it Sleeve and duplicate it and rename this one Shoulder Cap. So I'm gonna turn off the sleeve group so we can just see this one instance. I'll go into the Trim Paths and I'm going to change the start all the way up to 99.9%. And we're getting a half circle here, and that's because of the tapering. So let's go into the stroke, into the taper, and reset it. Now we have just a perfect circle at the end. This is going to serve as just that round cap. Now I can go back into the sleeve. I'll turn off the shoulder cap for a second, go into my stroke, and change the line cap from round to butt so that they're flat. Now we don't have that roundness anymore, and now my sleeve is getting cut off right where I wanted it to. We still have that taper, and if I turn my shoulder cap back on, we have that perfectly round capped shoulder, but I do need to scale it down a little bit because there is no taper on that stroke. So let's go back into shoulder cap, into stroke 1, and turn that stroke width down until it just matches the edges there. So right about there, we'll drop it down to say 60. That looks pretty good. Now I've made these two individual styles that together make up the actual sleeve. So what I'm going to do is select both of those groups and group them again, and I'll call this one sleeve. So that one style is the sleeve, that's done, and we can move on to the cuff. What I'm gonna do is base it on the sleeve that we've already created right in here. So I'm going to duplicate that, bring it outside of this sleeve group, and rename it cuff. So we'll go inside of that group and change the strokes color to just be black so we can distinguish it. And for this one, I do want to have the round cap. So I'm gonna change that line cap back to round. Now what I wanna do is just isolate a very small portion of this path using trim paths. And I could do this by adjusting the start and end values, but sometimes what I like to do is instead just set this to whatever percentage I want it to be. So let's say the start value's at 0 and I only want 3% of this stroke. I'll set the end to 3% and then use the offset value to move it back to where I actually want it to be. That way I know what percentage of the stroke I'm seeing, and it's just easier to adjust this way by playing with the end and the offset values instead of the start and end. At least that makes more sense in my head. So what I want to do now is go into the taper settings and see what we can do here. So I'll zoom in and I'll turn the start length up, and we'll turn the end length down so that we're not getting such an extreme amount of that taper. And then play around with the start width. So as I do this, it's going to push it out further, but if I introduce this start ease, remember that's going to kind of flatten it out. So let's put maybe a 40% ease on the start and end, and also make symmetrical links. So I'll just set the start and the end to both be 40. And the width values are going to kind of determine how flat the ends are. So I'm gonna turn that up to maybe 70 on both the start and end widths. And I think I could make that cuff a little bit bigger. So I'll go up to my trim paths, increase that end size a little bit. Maybe we'll increase the ease a little bit so it's a little less ovally, a little more pill shaped, but something like that is pretty good. Then I'll just align it using the offset value so that it kind of is centered right there where that sleeve end would be. And I can always go back and modify these values if I want something different. So there's something that's actually an oval. Maybe I increase the start and end ease to be a little bit flatter, but nice big round corners. That looks pretty cool. So maybe I'll set these to 80. But they also don't have to be symmetrical. That's the great thing about this, is you can dial this in to look however you want. So this is slightly bigger than what I had before. If I wanted to change that, again, it's as easy as just modifying that end value, and maybe 3.5 would be better. I was holding down Control while pressing the up and down arrow to do that incrementally. But let's call that good. So our cuff is done, our sleeve is done. Now all that's left is the arm. And again, I'm going to duplicate the sleeve group within here. So I'll just go in there, Controller Command D, and move this up to the top, and I'll rename it arm. So first things first, we need to change the color to be the skin color. We then need to go into the trim paths and drop the start value all the way down to 0. That's where the wrist is, and decrease the end value so that it aligns with the cuff. So I'm gonna have to zoom in here nice and close, and I am gonna hold down Control while clicking and dragging to get this very precisely aligned to the top edge of the cuff. Now, we do have an issue here. I'm not able to actually put this arm underneath the sleeve and in front of the cuff because the cuff is actually on top of the sleeve. There's not really a way to get that system to work. So I have a couple of options. First of all, I'm gonna reset the taper and then turn the stroke width down. So option number one is I could make this arm a lot skinnier so that those curved corners aren't clipping off the sharp corners that we have on the arm. The second thing I could do is play around with the taper. So I could, instead of making this smaller, maybe fill out the sleeve a little bit more, change the line cap to being a round cap, and then increase the end length to maybe say 3% and play around with the end ease until it kind of matches. So as long as I just get that close enough, then viewing this at 100%, you're probably never going to notice that there was a little bit of an overlap. And honestly, that pretty much got the job done. Now, obviously there are some discrepancies between this version and this version. I could always go back in and say, make the sleeve a little bit thicker. It's just that because this is broken up into a few different layers, I will have to do back and forth between some of these sizes. So why don't we increase the stroke width all the way up to say 90? Then I would also need to go into the shoulder cap and make sure that its stroke matches up so that we've got that nice shoulder lining up with the actual sleeve. Maybe we'll just increase that one more pixel. And then I'll need to jump down to the cuff group. So let's open that up, go into the stroke width for that and increase its width. There we go, now that aligns. And then I'll go into the arm, increase the stroke width of that as well. And now I'm able to have that wider width. I'd probably increase the easing a little bit more on the taper and maybe dial back the end length just a little bit, but that fits pretty well. But that's how I would approach styling a limb like this. And what's great is you have complete freedom to control how this actually bends. So the default bend is very cartoony. It's very round, but we can go into the Rubberhose settings and change the bend radius to be something less extreme. So maybe we put it down to say 25%, and then we're gonna get less bend in the more rigid parts of the limb. And that looks a little bit more lifelike. We could also turn the bend radius all the way off and maybe turn the realism up to say 80%, and then the limb's not going to shrink at all and it's not going to bend at all. It's just going to be a much more rigid looking limb. It all depends on the style of your character and the style of your character animation. But Rubberhose gives you that freedom to dial it in to look however you want. Now to recreate this leg, I'm actually going to reuse the styling from the arm as its foundation, and I'll show you how easy that is to do. Let's start by making a new hose, and I'll call this new leg, hip ankle, click the new Rubberhose button, and once again, I'm gonna change the hose length to 540. But now all I need to do is have that limb selected. So the new arm limb, go to the Style tab and click on this Copy Style button. Then I can jump over to this brand new limb that I just created, new leg, and paste that style, and it transfers everything that we just did over to this new limb. I could even alt-click on this copy button to save that style, and it will then end up in my style list permanently. So that's a great way to be able to build a style and just easily access it in any project. But anyway, now that this is copied over, you can see the similarities between the arm and the leg. There's a lot of shared design language. I just need to change some of the dimensions. So let me move the new leg and the controllers that belong to it up to the top, close this up, and go into the style for the new leg. First of all, let's change the sleeve to be named pant leg. So I'll just rename that, and I'll rename arm to leg. And then I'll go into the pant leg, rename sleeve pant, and instead of shoulder cap, we'll call this hip cap. But we need to change the stroke color for both the hip cap and the pant. So with both of those groups selected, I'll go to the stroke color and use my eyedropper to grab that green. So that's fixed. Now I need to go to the pant group, go into the trim paths, and change these values a little bit so that we can lengthen the pants a bit. So let's grab that start value and drop it down to about, let's say, 10%. Then I'll go into the cuff group, into its trim paths, and use the offset value to drop that down so that it's aligned nice and centered on this part of the pant leg. So right about there. Then we'll go into the actual leg group and go into that trim paths and just trim that end a little bit more so that it's aligned with that pant leg. So right there, right where the lip of that cuff is. And very easily, I've just recreated that look minus this line. And I'm gonna show you how I did that right now. So I'm going to use just, let's say, the pant leg again. I'll go into that pants group, duplicate pant, and drag it out. And actually I want this all the way on the top, and I'll rename this one stripe. And then we'll go into that styling, into the stroke, reset the taper, because this one does not need to be tapered, and change the color to black. And I want to make that stroke width much smaller. In fact, let's just drop it down to say 2. And I'll click off the layer so we can see, yep, that's pretty much the same width. Great, but I don't want it to go all the way down here, so I need to trim it back just a little bit. Let's grab the start value and increase it. I'm gonna press Control-Shift-H or Command-Shift-H on a Mac to hide all of my overlays so I can see this clearly, and I'll just drop that down to right about there. I'm okay with the end value going all the way up to where that controller is. Just press Control-Shift-H to bring my guides back one more time. But you'll notice that on the final version, it is not centered on the controller. It's not right in the middle of the limb. It's offset to the left a little bit. The way that I did that was very simple. I just went into the stripe transform controls. This is the transform controls for that group. Opened it up and just shifted the anchor point over a little bit so that it offsets. And with that, I've totally recreated the limb Very easy to reuse that style. And again, you can change this bend radius down if you don't want it to be so bendy and so cartoony. And go in at any time and adjust the trimming if I want it to be a little bit higher. There's so much that you can do. Any kind of styling that you can apply to a shape layer can basically be applied to a rubber hose limb. Now that those two styles are created, I was able to turn this into an entire character rig, adding in the torso and the head and animating this run cycle. I added some shoes to the character because I didn't think she'd want to be running barefoot, but I even added just a little bit of smear action right here. If you don't know about smear, click the card above right now. But this is just generating some smear frames on those shoe layers and makes for some really nice looking motion as these limbs are really being thrown around since they're so big and the proportions are so extreme on this character design. Now you can take what I just showed you and apply it to lots of different styles. So here's a very simple style. There's not a lot going on other than it is a tapered limb, which is nice, and it has that little cuff at the end. So nothing too extreme, but taking a lot of the same concepts as before. Tapering the limb, capping it off as a flat cap at one end and a round cap at the other, and then hiding that seam with a cuff. A lot of times you don't need to show the actual limb underneath the pants. If it's a pair of jeans or full-length pants, generally you don't see skin at the ankle. Or at the very most, you'd probably see a sock. So you don't have to overcomplicate things, and that's why I a lot of times will go to illustrators who have experience with character design to see how they handle things like the gap between the pant leg and the shoe. And then I have another style here that just has a barefooted leg, but it has this stitching that's very similar to the first style, but what I did was use the wave style to the stroke to get this kind of stitching look. So let me go into that styling and show you how that looks. So grab that style, open it up. Inside of the stitching in the stroke options, there's wave. And this is where I change the units to being cycles, the amount to 49%. You can really crank that up if you want. And then I just played around with the amount of cycles to dial in this specific look. Now, like I said, there are two other systems of rigging in rubber hose, rubber rig and rubber pin. These are both extremely powerful systems, and I will make a few more videos on this topic so that you can see how these systems can be implemented. But for now, that's the end of this tutorial. I hope that you got something out of it. If there are any questions you have about the rubber hose system, feel free to leave comments down in the description, and let me know if you want to learn more about this system. What kind of scenarios you'd like to see rubber hose be applied to. I'd be happy to make more content teaching you how to use one of my favorite ways to rig up characters. If you want to support more tutorials like this one, then please consider becoming a patron. You can find a link to that down in the description of this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.